My name is Leander Cross, and 3 months ago, I thought I knew my sister better than anyone. I was wrong. The diary I found after her death revealed secrets that shattered everything I believed about family, about love, and about the person I thought I was protecting all those years. What I discovered in those final pages didn't just change how I saw Melody. It exposed a truth so devastating that our parents tried to bury it forever. But some truths refuse to stay buried. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain hammered against my windshield as I pulled into the driveway of our childhood home in Millbrook Heights. October had always been Melody's favorite month. She used to say that changing leaves reminded her that beautiful things could die gracefully. Now, 3 weeks after her funeral, those words felt like prophecy rather than poetry. I sat in my car for several minutes, engine ticking as it cooled, staring at the house that had once been filled with laughter and music. Melody had been the musical one, always humming some melody she'd composed in her head, always tapping rhythms on whatever surface was nearby. The silence that greeted me now felt heavier than the storm clouds overhead. Mom had asked me to clean out Melody's room, said she couldn't bear to do it herself, and Dad had locked himself in his study for the better part of 3 weeks, emerging only for meals that he barely touched. I understood their grief, shared it even, but someone had to take care of the practical matters. Someone had to sort through the remnants of a life cut short at 24. The house smelled different when I stepped inside. Stale, somehow, like the air itself had been holding its breath since we lost her. Family photos lined the hallway leading to the stairs, chronicling our lives from childhood through college graduation. In every single picture, Melody was smiling. Not the forced smile people wear for cameras, but genuine joy that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep inside her. That's what made her death so incomprehensible. Depression, the doctors had said, a long battle with mental illness that none of us had seen coming. But looking at those photos now, I wondered how we'd missed the signs. How had someone so full of light been carrying such darkness? Melody's room was exactly as she'd left it. Mom hadn't touched anything, hadn't even opened the curtains. Dust motes danced in the thin streams of gray light that managed to penetrate the heavy fabric. Her bed was unmade, sheets twisted as if she'd struggled with sleep. Her desk was cluttered with sheet music, some completed compositions, others abandoned mid-measure. I moved through the space slowly, reverently, like a visitor in a museum dedicated to a life I thought I'd known intimately. We'd grown up in this house together, shared countless secrets, protected each other from the worst of our parents' occasional arguments. Melody had been my anchor through my own struggles in high school and college, always there with a listening ear or a terrible joke to lighten my mood. The closet felt like the logical place to start. I pulled down boxes from the top shelf, each one carefully labeled in Melody's precise handwriting. Photo albums, 2015-2018. Sheet music, compositions, college memories, personal items. I worked methodically, sorting things into piles for keeping, donating, or throwing away, though I found myself unable to part with most of her belongings. It was while reaching for a box labeled high school keepsakes that my hand brushed against something wedged behind the other containers. A small, leather-bound journal, worn soft from years of handling. I recognized it immediately. Melody had carried that diary everywhere during her senior year of high school and into college. I'd teased her about it countless times, calling her old-fashioned for writing by hand when everyone else was digital. The leather was warm against my palm as I settled onto her bed and opened to the first page. Her handwriting looked so alive, so present, that for a moment I could almost believe she was still here, still filling pages with her thoughts and dreams. I'd never read her diary before, had always respected her privacy, even though curiosity had tempted me more than once over the years. Now, with her gone, that privacy felt less important than understanding. Maybe somewhere in these pages I'd find clues that could help make sense of what happened. Maybe I'd find the darkness she'd been hiding, the depression that had claimed her life. The early entries were exactly what I'd expected. Complaints about professors, excitement about concerts she was planning to attend, detailed descriptions of dates with various boyfriends. She wrote about our parents, about me, about her dreams of becoming a professional composer. Her voice on the page was unmistakably hers, full of passion and humor and the fierce intelligence that had made her such a formidable debating partner during our teenage years. I flipped through months of entries, watching her life unfold in reverse chronology. Summer vacation stories, spring semester stress, winter break at home. The handwriting grew slightly less controlled as I moved backward through time, more rushed, sometimes smudged as if she'd been crying while writing. Then I reached the entries from her final semester, and everything changed. The first thing I noticed was how short they'd become. Where earlier entries had sprawled across multiple pages, these were concise, almost clinical in their brevity. The second thing I noticed was how often my name appeared. February 15th. Leander called again today. Had to let it go to voicemail. Can't keep pretending everything is normal when he asks how I'm doing. How do you tell your brother that you're drowning? February 20th. Saw Leander's girlfriend posted more photos from their trip to Colorado. They look so happy together. I remember when I used to believe happiness was possible for people like us. February 28th. Leander sent flowers for my birthday. The card said, "To the best sister a guy could ask for." If he only knew what kind of sister I really am. My hands were shaking as I turned the pages. This wasn't the depression I'd been expecting to find. This was something else entirely. Something that made my stomach clench with a dread I couldn't name. Melody's words were filled with self-recrimination and shame. But about what? What secret had she been carrying that made her feel unworthy of my affection? March 5th. Had the nightmare again. Always the same one. Leander finding out the truth and looking at me the way Dad looks at broken things he can't fix. Woke up screaming his name. March 12th. Dr. Martinez wants to increase my medication again. Says the anxiety and depression are treatment resistant. If she only knew that some things can't be medicated away. Some sins are too deep for pharmaceutical redemption. March 18th. Leander invited me to visit for Easter break. I want to go, want to pretend we're still the siblings we used to be. But how can I sit at his table, eat his food, accept his love, knowing what I've done, knowing what I've hidden from him all these years? The entries became increasingly fragmented after that. Single sentences scattered across pages, sometimes just words repeated over and over. Shame, guilt, sorry, Leander. I found myself flipping faster through the pages, desperate to understand what secret was tearing her apart, what truth she felt she couldn't share. And then I reached the final entry, dated just 2 days before her death. The handwriting was different here, more deliberate, as if she'd been forcing herself to slow down and write clearly. The page was tear-stained, the ink blurred in places, but the words were still legible, still devastating. April 22nd. I can't carry this anymore. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The weight of what I know, what I've kept hidden, it's destroying me from the inside out. Leander deserves to know the truth about what really happened that night 15 years ago. He deserves to know why Mom and Dad have never been the same. He deserves to know that his perfect little sister isn't a victim at all, but the cause of everything that went wrong in our family. I was 7 years old when I watched Uncle Marcus hurt Leander. I was 7 years old when I saw what he did to my brother in the basement during Dad's birthday party. And I was 7 years old when I decided to keep quiet because Uncle Marcus promised me that speaking up would destroy our family forever. But staying quiet destroyed us anyway, didn't it? It destroyed Leander's innocence. It destroyed Mom and Dad's marriage, even though they stayed together. It destroyed my ability to ever feel worthy of love. And now it's destroying me too, one sleepless night at a time. I thought I was protecting everyone by keeping the secret. I thought I was being brave by carrying the burden alone. But children aren't supposed to make those kinds of decisions. Children aren't supposed to choose between protecting their brother and protecting their family's reputation. I chose wrong, Leander. I chose silence when I should have chosen you. I chose family harmony when I should have chosen justice. I chose my own cowardice when I should have chosen your healing. You've spent your whole adult life wondering why you have trust issues, why intimacy feels dangerous, why you sometimes wake up screaming from nightmares you can't remember. You've spent thousands of dollars on therapy trying to understand trauma you can't locate. You've blamed yourself for being broken without knowing why you're broken. It's because of me, Leander. It's because I saw Uncle Marcus abuse you when we were children, and I said nothing. It's because I've watched you struggle with the aftermath of that trauma for 15 years while pretending I knew nothing about its source. It's because I've been complicit in your suffering by protecting the man who caused it. Uncle Marcus is still out there, still part of our extended family, still invited to Christmas dinners and birthday parties, still praised by everyone as such a wonderful man, such a devoted family member. And I've said nothing because I was a coward at 7 and I'm still a coward at 24. But I can't live with this anymore. I can't keep pretending that my silence was noble when it was selfish. I can't keep watching you blame yourself for something that was done to you, not by you. I can't keep being the sister who saved the family's reputation by sacrificing her brother's well-being. I'm going to tell Mom and Dad tomorrow. I'm going to tell them what I saw, what I've hidden, what I've allowed to continue. I know it will destroy them. I know they'll blame themselves for not protecting you, for not seeing what was happening in their own house. I know Uncle Marcus will deny everything, and half the family will choose sides, and everything will fall apart. But maybe that's what needs to happen. Maybe our family deserves to fall apart if it was built on a foundation of protecting predators and silencing victims. Maybe destruction is better than the slow poison of keeping deadly secrets. I love you, Leander. I've always loved you, even when my love was poisoned by guilt and shame. You deserved better than the sister you got. You deserved someone who would have screamed the house down the moment Uncle Marcus laid a hand on you. You deserved someone who would have chosen your safety over everyone else's comfort. I'm going to try to be that sister now, even though it's 15 years too late. I'm going to tell the truth, no matter what it costs. And then I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for the years I spent being a coward. If you're reading this, it means something happened to me before I could have that conversation with Mom and Dad. Please don't let my cowardice win. Please tell them what I couldn't. Please get the justice I was too afraid to seek for you. You are not broken, Leander. You are a survivor. And you deserved so much better than the family you got. I'm so sorry. For everything. For nothing. For the sister I should have been and never was. I love you. I have always loved you. I will always love you. Forever, your sister. The diary slipped from my hands and fell to the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the room. My mind was reeling, trying to process what I'd just read, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything I thought I knew about my childhood, my family, my own life. Uncle Marcus, Dad's younger brother, the one everyone called the life of the party. The uncle who always brought the best presents, who taught me to throw a curveball, who made everyone laugh with his terrible impressions and silly magic tricks. The uncle who had been at every family gathering for as long as I could remember, who was considered one of the most reliable and beloved members of our extended family. And somewhere in the deepest recesses of my memory, shadows began to shift. Fragments of sensation and fear that I'd spent years trying to forget suddenly clicked into place like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I was solving. The basement of our old house, the smell of his cologne mixed with something else, something that made my stomach turn. The feeling of being trapped, helpless, afraid to scream, because who would believe me over him? I had buried those memories so deep that they'd become like phantom limbs, present but not present, painful but not locatable. Years of therapy had helped me manage the symptoms without ever identifying the cause. Panic attacks, difficulty trusting people, nightmares I couldn't recall upon waking, an inexplicable fear of being alone with older men in positions of authority. Now, reading Melody's words, it all made terrible sense. The trauma I'd been carrying was real. The abuse I'd half remembered in fragments and flashes had actually happened. And my little sister had witnessed it, had carried the secret of my victimization for 15 years while watching me struggle with its effects. The guilt in her final entries took on new meaning now. She hadn't been guilty of causing my trauma. She'd been guilty of failing to prevent its continuation. In her 7-year-old mind, keeping quiet had been the right choice, the choice that would protect our family. But as she grew older, she began to understand the true cost of that silence. I picked up the diary again, rereading the final entry through tears I hadn't realized were falling. My sister hadn't just been battling depression, she'd been battling the weight of a secret that was literally eating her alive. Every day she'd watched me struggle with the aftermath of abuse while knowing she could have stopped it years ago. Every interaction we'd had as adults had been colored by her guilt and shame over her childhood silence. And now she was gone, taking with her any chance to have the conversation that might have saved both of us. But she'd left the diary. She'd left the truth written in her own hand, dated and detailed and impossible to deny. She'd found a way to break her silence even in death, to finally give me the answers I'd been seeking for years without knowing what questions to ask. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady, and walked to the window. Outside, the storm was beginning to clear, but inside me, a different kind of storm was just beginning. Because now, I had a choice to make. The same choice Melody had been preparing to make when she died. I could keep her secret, maintain the family's peace, continue to let Uncle Marcus attend gatherings and be beloved by everyone who didn't know what he'd done. Or I could honor my sister's final wish. I could tell our parents the truth she'd been too afraid to speak. I could seek the justice she'd wanted to help me find. I could ensure that Uncle Marcus would never have the opportunity to hurt another child the way he'd hurt me. The choice should have been easy, but I understood now why it had been so difficult for Melody. Telling the truth would indeed destroy our family as we knew it. It would force our parents to confront their failure to protect their own child. It would split our extended family along lines of belief and disbelief. It would turn every future family gathering into a minefield of tension and accusation. But keeping quiet would be worse. Keeping quiet would mean letting Melody's death be meaningless. It would mean continuing to protect a predator at the expense of his victims. It would mean that my 7-year-old sister's impossible choice would continue to define both of our lives even after hers had ended. I pulled out my phone and stared at it for a long moment, thumb hovering over Mom's contact information. It was nearly 7 in the evening, and I could hear her and Dad moving around downstairs, probably starting dinner preparations. They were still in the thick of their own grief, still trying to process the loss of their daughter. Was now really the time to add this devastation to their pain? But when would be the right time? When would it ever be easy to tell your parents that their son had been sexually abused by their brother-in-law, and that their daughter had died carrying the weight of that secret? There was no good time for such a conversation, no gentle way to deliver such news. I thought about Melody's words, about the years she'd spent watching me struggle with trauma I couldn't name or locate. I thought about the therapy sessions where I'd tried to explain symptoms without understanding their source. The relationships I'd sabotaged because intimacy felt dangerous. The nights I'd woken up screaming from dreams I couldn't remember. I thought about Uncle Marcus, who would be at Christmas dinner in 2 months, who would bring presents and tell jokes and be welcomed with open arms by people who had no idea what he'd done, who might have already moved on to other victims, other families, other children who were too afraid or too confused to speak up. The phone felt heavy in my hand as I scrolled to Mom's number. My finger trembled as I hit call, and for a moment I almost hung up before it could ring. But then I heard Melody's voice in my head, not as I'd last heard it 3 weeks ago at her funeral, but as she'd sounded when we were children, strong and determined and ready to fight the whole world if necessary to protect the people she loved. She'd finally found the courage to fight for me, even if it had come too late to save her own life. The least I could do was find the courage to honor that fight. "Leander?" Mom's voice was tired when she answered, worn down by weeks of grief and confusion. "Everything okay up there? You've been quiet for a while." I took a deep breath, looking around Melody's room one more time. At the sheet music scattered across her desk, compositions she'd never finish. At the photos pinned to her bulletin board, capturing moments of joy and laughter from a life cut tragically short. At the diary lying open on her bed, pages filled with 15 years of secret suffering. "Mom," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I need you and Dad to come up here. There's something we need to talk about. Something about Melody and about our family. Something that's going to be very difficult to hear." There was a long pause, and I could almost hear her bracing herself for another blow in a season that had already brought too many. "What is it, honey?" I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of Melody's secret shifting from her shoulders to mine, but also feeling something else. Relief. The terrible relief of finally being able to name the monster that had been chasing me through the shadows of my own life. "Just please come up here," I said, "both of you, and Mom, you might want to sit down." 20 minutes later, we were all sitting in Melody's room, the diary open between us like evidence in a trial that was 15 years overdue. I'd read them the final entry in its entirety, my voice breaking several times as I delivered my sister's posthumous confession. When I finished, the silence that followed was deeper than the one I'd encountered when I first entered the house. Dad was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus," he said, and the name sounded different coming from his mouth now. Not like the beloved brother he'd always spoken of, but like a curse word, something bitter and contaminated. Mom was crying silently, one hand pressed to her mouth as if to hold back a scream. "The nightmares," she said finally. "You had such terrible nightmares when you were little. We never understood why. We thought it was just childhood fears, growing pains." I nodded, pieces of my own puzzle continuing to click into place. The therapy helped with the symptoms, but I could never identify the cause of the trauma. I always felt like I was missing something, like there was some key piece of my own story that I couldn't access. "He was here so often," Dad said, his voice gaining strength as anger began to replace shock. "Marcus was always here, always part of every celebration, every holiday. Jesus Christ, we invited him into our home. We trusted him with our children." "He played the part perfectly," I replied, thinking of all the times Uncle Marcus had been praised as such a wonderful family man, such a devoted uncle. That's how predators operate. They don't look like monsters, they look like the people we trust most. Mom reached for the diary with shaking hands, reading through the final entry again, as if hoping the words might change or disappear. "She carried this alone for 15 years, she whispered. "Our baby girl carried this terrible secret alone, and it killed her." The truth of that statement hit me like a physical blow. Melody hadn't died from depression in some abstract sense. She died from the specific depression that came from carrying guilt and shame that wasn't hers to carry. She died from the weight of believing she was responsible for my continued suffering, that her childhood silence had made her complicit in my abuse. "She was 7 years old," I said, as much to my parents. "She was a little girl who was put in an impossible situation and made the choice that seemed safest at the time. She can't be blamed for that." "But she blamed herself," Dad said, his voice thick with his own guilt. "And we failed both of you. We failed to protect you from Marcus, and we failed to create an environment where Melody felt safe telling us what she'd witnessed." We sat in silence for several more minutes, each of us processing the magnitude of what we'd learned and what it meant for our family going forward. The storm outside had passed completely, leaving behind a clear evening sky that felt almost mocking in its beauty. How could the world look so normal when everything I thought I knew about my life had just been turned upside down? Finally, I stood up and walked to Melody's desk, gathering some of her sheet music into a neat pile. The compositions were beautiful, complex pieces that spoke to her talent and her potential. So much potential, lost to a secret she should never have had to keep. "We have to tell the police," I said, not turning around to face my parents. "And we have to tell the family, all of it. What Marcus did, what Melody saw, why she felt she couldn't speak up." "Leander," Mom said carefully, "it's been 15 years. Without physical evidence, without Melody to corroborate what she wrote, it's going to be very difficult to build any kind of legal case." I turned to face them, and I could see the fear in their eyes. Not fear of Marcus necessarily, but fear of what the truth would do to our extended family, to the relationships and structures they'd spent decades building and maintaining. It was the same fear that had kept Melody silent as a child, the fear that speaking up would cause more damage than staying quiet. "I don't care about building a legal case," I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "I care about making sure everyone in our family knows what kind of man they've been welcoming into their homes. I care about making sure Marcus never has access to children again. And I care about honoring Melody's final wish to tell the truth no matter what it costs." Dad stood up slowly, his face aging years in the span of our conversation. "You're right," he said. "We should have protected you then, but we can protect other children now. We should have believed in truth and justice then, but we can choose them now." Mom nodded through her tears. "Marcus has grandchildren," she said quietly. "His son has 2 little girls. If there's even a chance—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. We all understood what she was saying. If Marcus had abused me as a child, there was a very real possibility he'd moved on to other victims. His own grandchildren might be at risk right now, while we sat in Melody's room debating whether speaking up was worth the family disruption it would cause. The choice became clearer then. This wasn't just about seeking justice for past wrongs. It was about preventing future ones. It wasn't just about honoring Melody's memory. It was about protecting children who might be in danger right now. "I'll call Marcus first," Dad said, his voice hardening with resolve. "Give him a chance to hear it from me before the rest of the family finds out, though God knows he doesn't deserve that courtesy. And then we call everyone else," Mom added, "the whole family. They deserve to know what kind of man they've been trusting with their children." I picked up the diary, holding it carefully, as if it were made of spun glass. In a way, it was. These pages contained the most fragile and precious gift my sister could have given me, the truth she died trying to tell. The truth that explained so much about my life, about her life, about the invisible wounds that had shaped both of us in ways we'd barely understood. "There's something else," I said, flipping to an earlier entry I'd noticed while reading. She mentions Dr. Martinez, her therapist. Melody was getting treatment, was taking medication. Her death wasn't inevitable, wasn't the unavoidable result of some untreatable condition. She died from the weight of carrying a secret that was destroying her. The implications of that statement hung in the air between us. If Melody had found the courage to speak up sooner, if she'd told her therapist about the guilt she was carrying, if she'd felt safe confiding in her family about what she'd witnessed, she might still be alive. Her death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a preventable tragedy. "We failed her," Mom said, voice breaking completely. "We created a family environment where our daughter felt she couldn't tell us that she'd witnessed her brother being abused. What does that say about us as parents?" It was a question I couldn't answer, not in any way that would bring comfort. But I could see that they were beginning to understand something important: the cost of silence, the price of prioritizing family harmony over family truth. Melody had paid that price with her life, and I'd paid it with years of undiagnosed trauma and inexplicable suffering. "We can't change what happened," I said finally, "but we can change what happens next. We can make sure that Melody's courage in writing this diary wasn't wasted. We can make sure that other children don't pay the price for our family's silence." Dad pulled out his phone, staring at it for a long moment before scrolling to Marcus's contact information. "I don't even know what to say to him," he admitted. "How do you confront someone about something like this? How do you ask your brother if he sexually abused your son 15 years ago?" "You don't ask," I replied. "You tell him what you know and what you're going to do about it. You tell him that his victim and his witness are no longer going to be silent about what he did. You tell him that the family protection he's enjoyed for 15 years is over." Mom reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly. "Are you ready for this, Leander? Once we start making these calls, once we set this truth in motion, there's no taking it back. Our family is going to explode. People are going to choose sides. Some of them aren't going to believe us." I thought about that for a moment, imagining the reactions we'd face: shock, denial, anger, accusations that we were lying or misremembering or motivated by some hidden agenda. There would be family members who would defend Marcus, who would argue that these were just the fantasies of a disturbed young woman, that we were dishonoring Melody's memory by sharing such terrible accusations after her death. But then I thought about Melody's final words, about her wish that I would get the justice she'd been too afraid to seek. I thought about the children who might be at risk right now, the future victims who could be spared if we found the courage to speak up. I thought about the years I'd spent in therapy trying to heal from trauma I couldn't name, and about the relief I already felt just from finally understanding the source of my pain. "I'm ready," I said. "Melody spent 15 years being ready to tell this truth. The least I can do is be ready to hear it honored." Dad nodded and dialed Marcus's number. As the phone rang, I could see his hands shaking slightly, could see the weight of what he was about to do settling on his shoulders. This conversation would change everything, would destroy the brotherly relationship he'd maintained with Marcus for over 4 decades. But it would also finally give voice to the truth that had been poisoning our family from the inside out for 15 years. It would finally honor the courage my sister had found in her final days, the courage to choose justice over family harmony, truth over convenient silence. "Marcus," Dad said when the call connected, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "We need to talk. About Leander. About what happened when he was 9. About what Melody saw you do to him in our basement." Even from where I sat, I could hear the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. A pause that lasted too long. The silence of someone calculating their next move, rather than expressing shock or confusion at false accusations. "I don't know what you think you know, David," Marcus's voice came through the speaker, careful and controlled, "but you're making a mistake. A very serious mistake." "The only mistake," Dad replied, looking directly at me as he spoke, "was staying silent for 15 years. That mistake ends today." And with those words, the truth that had killed my sister finally began to set us free. If you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of suicide, please reach out for help. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is available 24/7 at 988. Remember, you are not alone. Your story matters, and help is available. The silence that followed Dad's words to Marcus stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, could feel Mom's hand trembling in mine as we waited for his response. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice had shifted completely from the careful control of moments before to something colder, more calculating. "You're grieving, David. You're not thinking clearly. Melody was sick. We all knew that. She was taking medications that can cause delusions, hallucinations. You can't seriously be considering believing the fantasies of a mentally ill girl who killed herself." The callousness of his words hit me like a physical blow.
This was my sister he was talking about, the woman whose funeral he'd attended just 3 weeks ago with tears in his eyes and flowers in his hands. Now he was dismissing her final confession as the delusions of a sick mind, using her death as ammunition against her credibility. Her mind was perfectly clear when she wrote this, I said. She documented specific details, dates, locations. This isn't some vague accusation, Marcus. This is a detailed account of what she witnessed you do to me. She was 7 years old, Leander. Children misinterpret things, especially traumatic events. Even if she saw something she didn't understand, that doesn't mean what she thought she saw actually happened.
The gaslighting was seamless, practiced. I wondered how many times over the years Marcus had perfected this response, how many other accusations he'd deflected with this same combination of concern for the accuser's mental state and reasonable doubt about childhood memories. "I remember now," I said quietly, and I could hear Marcus's sharp intake of breath through the phone. Reading Melody's words unlocked memories I'd buried for 15 years. The basement of our old house, the smell of your cologne mixed with beer, the way you told me it was our special secret, that no one would believe me if I told them what happened. You're letting grief and suggestion corrupt your memories. This is exactly what happens when people go looking for trauma where none exists. You're creating false memories based on your sister's delusions. But even as he spoke, I could hear something else in his voice now. Desperation. The careful control was beginning to crack, and underneath it was the voice of a man who knew his secrets were finally being exposed. "The birthmark on your left shoulder," I said, details flooding back with crystalline clarity. "Shaped like a crescent moon. You made me touch it, said it was proof that we were connected, that our special relationship was written in the stars." The silence that followed was different this time. Not the pause of someone calculating their next move, but the silence of someone who had just been caught in an undeniable lie. There was no way I could know about that birthmark unless I'd seen Marcus without his shirt. No innocent explanation for why a 9-year-old boy would have that information. "I think this conversation is over," Marcus said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "I won't be subjected to these accusations from people who are clearly not in their right minds. When you're ready to apologize for this attack on my character, you know where to find me." The line went dead, but none of us moved to end the call on our side. We sat in stunned silence, processing what had just happened. Marcus hadn't denied the accusations with the righteous indignation of an innocent man. He'd deflected, minimized, attacked the credibility of his accusers, and then fled the conversation when confronted with evidence he couldn't explain away. "He didn't deny it," Mom said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Not once in that entire conversation did he actually deny what Melody wrote. Dad set his phone down with shaking hands. 43 years I've known my brother. 43 years I've trusted him, defended him, welcomed him into my home. How did I not see what he really was? "Because predators are experts at hiding in plain sight," I replied, thinking of all the research I'd done over the years trying to understand my own trauma responses. They choose their victims carefully. They groom families as well as children, and they rely on exactly the kind of disbelief and minimization Marcus just displayed. "What happens now?" Mom asked. "He's going to tell his version to the rest of the family. He's going to say we're having some kind of breakdown, that we're making up stories to deal with our grief." I stood up and walked to Melody's window, looking out at the now clear evening sky. Stars were beginning to appear, faint pinpricks of light in the gathering darkness. Melody had always loved astronomy, had taught me the names of constellations when we were children. Looking up at those same stars now, I felt her presence somehow, felt her courage flowing into me. "Let him tell his version," I said. "Truth has a way of surfacing eventually, and we're not the only ones who know now." Over the next 2 hours, we made 17 phone calls to aunts and uncles, cousins and family friends, grandparents and siblings-in-law. Each conversation was more difficult than the last. Each revelation met with shock, denial, anger, or some combination of all three. Some family members believed us immediately.
Aunt Patricia, Dad's oldest sister, listened in horrified silence before admitting she'd always felt uncomfortable with how much attention Marcus paid to the children at family gatherings. Cousin Jake revealed that he'd had his own disturbing encounter with Marcus years ago, but had never told anyone because he was afraid no one would believe him. Others were less receptive. Uncle Robert accused us of fabricating stories to cope with Melody's death, of dishonoring her memory by spreading lies. Cousin Sarah hung up on us mid-conversation, refusing to hear another word against someone she'd always considered a model family man. The most difficult call was to Marcus's son, Thomas. He listened in stony silence as Dad explained what Melody had witnessed, what I had remembered, what Marcus had refused to deny. When Dad finished, Thomas was quiet for so long I thought the call had been dropped. "My daughters," Thomas said finally, his voice hollow with a fear I recognized all too well. "Emma and Sophie. They're 6 and 8. They spend weekends at Dad's house sometimes, when Rebecca and I need a break. Jesus Christ, he used my sister's death as an excuse to get access to my children." I could hear Thomas breaking down on the other end of the line, the terrible realization that he might have unknowingly put his own daughters in harm's way. It was a pain I understood intimately, the guilt of not recognizing danger when it was hiding in plain sight. "You need to talk to Emma and Sophie," I said, hating myself for having to voice the words. "Tonight. In a safe, gentle way, you need to ask them if Grandpa Marcus has ever done anything that made them uncomfortable." How do I even ask that question? How do I ask my 6-year-old daughter if her grandfather has been molesting her? Mom took the phone from Dad's hands. "Thomas, honey, I know this is the hardest thing in the world to face, but children are remarkably resilient when they feel safe and supported. There are gentle ways to have these conversations, ways that don't traumatize them further." We spent another 20 minutes on the phone with Thomas, walking him through resources for speaking with children about abuse, giving him the contact information for child psychologists who specialized in trauma assessment. By the time we hung up, he'd made the decision to take Emma and Sophie to be evaluated by professionals, regardless of what they disclosed in initial conversations. "He's going to call Child Protective Services too," Thomas had said before ending the call. "File a report so there's an official record of the allegations. Even if we can't prove what happened 15 years ago, we can make sure there's documentation if anything happens going forward." The house felt different after we finished making the calls. Not quieter exactly, but charged with a different kind of energy. For 15 years, Melody's secret had been like a poison gas filling every room, invisible but toxic. Now that the truth was out, that poison was finally beginning to dissipate. But I knew the hardest parts were still ahead of us. Within hours, word would spread through our extended family network. Sides would be chosen, alliances would be formed, accusations and counter-accusations would fly. Marcus wouldn't go down without a fight, and that fight was going to tear apart relationships that had been decades in the making. Around 10 that evening, my phone started buzzing with text messages. The first few were supportive family members offering love and solidarity. But as the night wore on, the messages became more hostile. "You should be ashamed of yourself, using Melody's death to destroy an innocent man." That one was from Cousin Linda, Marcus's staunchest defender. "Your sister was mentally ill. Stop using her delusions to get attention." From Uncle Robert's wife, a woman who'd never shown me anything but kindness until tonight. "Marcus is considering legal action for defamation. You better have proof for these accusations." From Marcus himself, sent from a number I didn't recognize.
I showed the messages to my parents, watching their faces fall as they read each hostile response. This was the cost of truth-telling in a family that had built its identity around keeping certain secrets buried. We were being treated not as victims seeking justice, but as troublemakers disrupting the peace. "I'm sorry," Mom said after reading through all the messages. "I'm sorry that protecting you and honoring Melody is coming at such a high price. I'm sorry our family is making you pay for speaking the truth." "Don't apologize," I replied, deleting the worst of the messages without responding to them. Melody paid a much higher price for staying silent. If facing some angry text messages is the cost of preventing other children from going through what I went through, it's a bargain. Dad had been quiet for most of the evening, but now he stood up with a determination I hadn't seen from him in years. I need to drive over to Marcus's house, he said. This conversation isn't finished. David, no, Mom said quickly. He's already threatened legal action. If you go over there tonight, if this turns into some kind of confrontation, it'll just give him more ammunition to use against us. I don't care about his legal threats. I care about looking my brother in the eye and telling him that he will never, ever have access to another child in this family. I care about making sure he understands that his days of hiding behind family loyalty are over. I understood Dad's need for confrontation, the burning desire to face Marcus directly and demand answers that would never come. But Mom was right about the risks. Anything Dad said or did tonight could be twisted and used against us later, could be painted as harassment or intimidation by a family in emotional distress. Let me go instead, I said, surprising myself with the words even as they left my mouth. I'm the victim here. I have the right to confront my abuser, to ask for the accountability he's never provided. Both of my parents stared at me in shock. The idea of me voluntarily putting myself in a room with Marcus after everything we'd just learned and remembered was clearly terrifying to them. Leander, honey, you don't owe him anything, Mom said. You don't need to put yourself through that kind of trauma for closure or justice or any other reason. Maybe not, I agreed, but I need to look him in the eye and tell him that I remember what he did. I need him to know that his victim isn't a confused 9-year-old boy anymore, that I'm a grown man who understands exactly what happened and isn't afraid to name it. The drive to Marcus's house took 25 minutes through the quiet suburban streets where I'd grown up. Every landmark I passed held memories now that I was finally able to place in context. The park where Marcus had taught me to throw a curveball, where he'd praised my athletic ability and made me feel special, chosen. The ice cream shop where he'd taken me for private treats, just the two of us, building the kind of exclusive relationship that groomed children learn to treasure. Marcus lived in a well-maintained colonial on the far side of town, the kind of house that spoke to financial success and social respectability. The porch light was on, and I could see his silhouette moving behind the living room curtains. He was awake, probably expecting some kind of confrontation after the evening's revelations. I sat in my car for several minutes before getting out, trying to center myself for what was about to happen. This was the first time I'd be alone with Marcus since I was 9 years old. The first time I'd be in his presence while fully aware of what he'd done to me. The adult part of my brain knew I was safe, knew I was no longer the vulnerable child he'd victimized. But some deeper part of me was terrified, flooded with the primal fear that had kept those memories buried for so long. I rang the doorbell at exactly 11 o'clock. Marcus opened the door almost immediately, as if he'd been waiting by the window. He looked older than I remembered, more fragile somehow, but his eyes still held the same calculating intelligence that had allowed him to manipulate and abuse with impunity for so many years. "Leander," he said, stepping aside to let me enter. "I wondered if you'd show up tonight." "We need to talk," I replied, following him into the living room where I'd played video games and watched movies during dozens of family visits over the years. The room looked exactly the same, but my perception of it was entirely different now. This wasn't the safe haven of a beloved uncle. It was the lair of a predator who'd used family gatherings as hunting grounds. "I assume you're here because you want to continue the conversation your father started this evening," Marcus said, settling into his favorite armchair with the casual confidence of a man who believed he still held all the cards. "I'm here because I remember what you did to me," I said, remaining standing so I could maintain the psychological advantage of height. "I remember the basement, the games you called them, the way you convinced me it was normal, special, something that proved how much you loved me." For just a moment, Marcus's mask slipped, and I saw something flicker across his face. Not guilt or remorse, but annoyance, the irritation of someone whose carefully constructed lies were being dismantled. "Children have such vivid imaginations," he said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. Especially children who are dealing with trauma and loss. The mind can create very convincing false memories when it's looking for someone to blame for unexplained pain. "Stop," I said, cutting him off mid-sentence. "We're alone now, Marcus. There's no audience to perform for, no family reputation to protect. You can drop the act." He studied me for a long moment, and I could see him reassessing the situation, recalculating his approach.
The scared 9-year-old boy he'd victimized was gone, replaced by a 34-year-old man who was no longer willing to be gaslit or manipulated. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice dropping the pretense of concern and taking on a harder edge. "Money? Some kind of public apology? What's it going to take to make this go away?" The casual way he offered to buy my silence told me everything I needed to know about how he'd handled similar situations in the past. This wasn't his first accusation, wasn't his first time having to manage the fallout from his predatory behavior. He had a playbook for these situations, a strategy that had probably worked for him before. "I don't want your money," I said. "I want you to stay away from children. All children, but especially Emma and Sophie. If you ever try to be alone with Thomas's daughters again, if you ever try to put yourself in a position where you could hurt them the way you hurt me, I will make sure every person in this town knows exactly what kind of man you are." Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of humor or warmth. "You think you have some kind of power here? You think anyone is going to believe the word of a man with documented mental health issues over someone with my reputation in this community?" "I think the truth has a way of coming out eventually," I replied. "I think predators get sloppy over time, confident in their ability to manipulate and control, and I think you've gotten too comfortable hiding behind family loyalty and community standing." "Even if I were guilty of what you're accusing me of," Marcus said, leaning forward in his chair, "what makes you think anyone would care? It was 15 years ago, Leander. You were a troubled kid from a broken home whose parents were too distracted by their own problems to pay attention to what was happening to their son. No one protected you then, and no one's going to seek justice for you now." The cruelty of his words was breathtaking, but also revealing. By acknowledging that no one had protected me then, he was essentially admitting that there had been something I needed protection from. His mask was slipping further, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "You're right that no one protected me then," I said. "But that was because they didn't know what was happening. Now they do. Now the whole family knows what kind of man you really are, and that knowledge changes everything." "The family will choose sides," Marcus said, with confidence that chilled me. "Some will believe your story, most won't. In 6 months, this will all blow over, and things will go back to the way they were. Family scandals always do." "Maybe," I acknowledged, "but it only takes one person believing me to keep you away from the children you might hurt next. It only takes one person staying vigilant to prevent another family from going through what mine has been through." Marcus stood up abruptly, his composure finally cracking completely. "Get out of my house," he snarled. "You and your mentally ill sister and your delusional parents can spread whatever lies you want."
I've built a life in this community, earned respect and trust that can't be destroyed by the fantasies of a dead girl and her damaged brother. I walked toward the door, but paused with my hand on the knob. "Melody died carrying the weight of your secret," I said without turning around. "She died believing she was responsible for my suffering because she didn't speak up when she was 7 years old. Her death is on your hands, Marcus, just like my abuse was. And someday, somehow, you're going to have to account for both." I left him standing in his living room, surrounded by the trappings of respectability he'd used to hide his true nature for so many years. The drive home felt different than the drive there. Lighter somehow, as if confronting him had lifted a weight I'd been carrying without realizing it. When I got back to my parents' house, I found them waiting up for me in the kitchen, cups of cold coffee in front of them and worry etched deep in their faces. "How did it go?" Mom asked as I sat down at the table where we'd shared thousands of family meals over the years. "He didn't deny it," I said simply. "Not directly anyway. But he made it clear that he sees this as a problem to be managed rather than a crime to be acknowledged. He's already planning his counterattack, already confident that his reputation will protect him." "What kind of counterattack?" Dad asked, his voice tight with concern. "He's going to paint us as a grieving family in crisis, making up stories to deal with our loss. He's going to use Melody's mental health history against her credibility, and he's going to use my history of therapy and anxiety to suggest that I'm creating false memories." We sat in silence for several minutes, each of us processing the reality of what we were up against. Marcus wasn't just a predator, he was a skilled manipulator who'd had years to perfect his defense strategies. Fighting him wouldn't just mean telling our truth, it would mean weathering a sustained attack on our credibility, our mental health, and our motivations. "I got a call from Thomas while you were gone," Dad said eventually. "He talked to Emma and Sophie tonight. Gentle questions, nothing leading or traumatic, but Emma broke down crying when he asked if Grandpa Marcus had ever made her feel uncomfortable." My stomach dropped. What did she say? That he liked to give her special baths when she stayed overnight. That he told her it was their secret, something that made her extra special to him. She didn't understand why it made her feel bad, but she knew it was wrong somehow. The parallel to my own experience was devastating and unmistakable. Marcus was still using the same tactics, still targeting vulnerable children, still relying on secrecy and manipulation to maintain his access to victims. "Thomas is taking both girls to a child psychologist tomorrow," Mom added. "He's also filed a report with Child Protective Services and contacted a lawyer about getting a restraining order to keep Marcus away from the children." "Good," I said, feeling a fierce surge of protectiveness for nieces I barely knew. At least Emma and Sophie won't have to carry these secrets for 15 years the way Melody and I did. Over the following days, our family civil war intensified. Marcus hired a lawyer and began threatening defamation suits against anyone who repeated the allegations. Several family members rallied to his defense, organizing a counter-narrative that painted him as the victim of false accusations from unstable relatives. But other evidence began emerging as people found the courage to speak up. Cousin Jake formally reported his own childhood encounter with Marcus to the police. A family friend revealed that her teenage daughter had complained about Marcus's inappropriate comments and touching at a birthday party the previous year. Thomas's lawyer subpoenaed Marcus's computer and found a disturbing collection of child imagery that, while not illegal, established a clear pattern of sexual interest in minors. The investigation that followed was thorough and painful. Police interviews, psychological evaluations, court hearings that felt like trials where we were simultaneously the prosecutors and the defendants. Marcus maintained his innocence throughout, portraying himself as a devoted family man being destroyed by malicious accusations. But the evidence was overwhelming. Emma's testimony, given in a child-friendly forensic interview, corroborated the pattern of grooming and abuse that multiple victims now described. The digital evidence from Marcus's devices, combined with witness testimony from family members who'd observed inappropriate behavior over the years, painted a picture of systematic predation that spanned decades. 6 months after I'd found Melody's diary, Marcus pled guilty to multiple counts of child sexual abuse in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison and lifetime registration as a sex offender. The plea agreement meant we avoided a lengthy trial, but it also meant we never got the full accounting of his crimes that a conviction might have provided. The family relationships that survived the revelations were forever changed. Some relatives cut off contact entirely, unable to reconcile their image of Marcus with the reality of what he'd done. Others struggled with guilt over signs they'd missed or ignored, moments when they could have intervened but chose to look the other way. But there were also unexpected sources of healing. Cousin Jake and I developed a bond born of shared experience, supporting each other through the legal process and the aftermath. Thomas's family grew closer to ours as we worked together to help Emma and Sophie process their trauma in healthy ways. Even some of the relatives who'd initially defended Marcus eventually acknowledged the truth and offered their support. The most profound change, though, was in my relationship with Melody's memory. For years after her death, I'd carried guilt about all the signs of her depression I'd missed, all the ways I'd failed to save her. But understanding the real source of her pain, the impossible burden she'd carried alone, transformed my grief into something more complex but ultimately more healing. I established a foundation in Melody's name, focused on supporting survivors of childhood sexual abuse and their families. The organization provided therapy funding, legal support, and advocacy training for people navigating the complex process of reporting abuse and seeking justice. It felt like the most meaningful way to honor both her courage in finally telling the truth and her commitment to protecting other children from the predator she'd been too young to stop herself.
On the first anniversary of finding her diary, I visited Melody's grave with a letter I'd written to her. I read it aloud in the quiet cemetery, sharing everything that had happened since her final confession had set the truth in motion. "You saved Emma and Sophie," I told her gravestone. "Your courage to write down what you'd witnessed, even when you thought it might destroy our family, prevented Marcus from hurting them the way he hurt me. You were never the coward you believed yourself to be. You were a 7-year-old girl in an impossible situation, and a 24-year-old woman who found the strength to choose justice over silence." The wind rustled through the oak tree that shaded her grave, and for a moment I could almost hear her voice carried on the breeze. Not the tortured, guilty voice of her final diary entries, but the bright, fierce voice of the sister who'd protected me in all the ways she could, who'd loved me enough to carry an unbearable secret for 15 years, and who'd finally found the strength to set both of us free. The truth had indeed destroyed our family as we knew it, but from the wreckage of those broken relationships and shattered illusions, something stronger had emerged. A family built on honesty rather than secrets, on protecting the vulnerable rather than preserving appearances, on choosing difficult truths over comfortable lies. My sister had made that choice. The least I could do was honor it by living the rest of my life in the light of that truth, protecting other children from the darkness she'd helped expose, and ensuring that her sacrifice had meaning that extended far beyond our own broken family. The diary that had revealed our family's deepest secret now sat in a safe deposit box, preserved as evidence not just of Marcus's crimes, but of Melody's ultimate act of love. She'd given me the greatest gift possible, the truth that set me free, and the courage to use that freedom to protect others who couldn't protect themselves. In the end, that was the real legacy of her short life and tragic death. Not the music she'd never finish composing, not the dreams she'd never fulfill, but the children who would sleep safely in their beds because she'd finally found her voice and refused to let it be silenced by shame or fear or the terrible weight of family loyalty. Her courage had saved us all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.